Welcome to video 16.1b. Our focus here will be reaction mechanisms. So, Neutron walks into a restaurant and orders a couple of Cokes. As she's about to leave, she asks the waiter how much she owes. The waiter replies, "For you, no charge." In terms of your prior knowledge, yes, you do need to remember rates of reaction, just like previously. Still too obvious, maybe. And also order of reaction from experimental results from 16.1a. The big idea for this video is the same as 16.1a, but the focus for this video are on mechanisms and what it means to be a mechanism. Essentially, a mechanism is a step-by-step look at the process of collisions that are required in order for reaction to take place. So some understandings that we'll focus on, something called the rate determining step and molecularity as we look at mechanisms. So one of the things we need to understand is that most reactions occur as a series of elementary steps, and these elementary steps are where the collisions must take place. And that sequence of steps is called the mechanism. The mechanism must be determined by experimental analysis coming from rate of reaction data. And truthfully, mechanisms are only proposals that are supported by the evidence. And the evidence that will support the mechanism the most is what we studied in the previous video, which is order of reaction with respect to specific reactants. So now we see why that is important, why the understanding order of reaction for specific species is important. So let's look at an example reaction. Nitrogen dioxide plus carbon monoxide makes nitrogen monoxide and carbon dioxide. This proposed mechanism is a two-step mechanism whereby two molecules of NO2 must collide to form NO and NO3. And then this NO3 must collide with a CO molecule to form NO2 and CO2. So I want you to notice that NO3 is an intermediate. The idea of an intermediate is it is formed, then used up. And it's not just a transition state, but an actual intermediate that will exist for a moment in time because it is a real species. It's not a transition state. I also want you to notice that NO2 was used, sort of 2 moles of NO2 were used in step 1, but 1 mole of NO2 was produced in step 2. So that means overall, if I want to look at the overall reaction, NO2 plus CO makes NO plus CO2. The NO3 cancels, NO2 cancels, and I'm left with the overall reaction. So this is a two-step reaction as a mechanism. The idea of molecularity in each of the elementary steps above, it is bimolecular because there are two species that must collide, two molecules or two particles that must collide. We can have a unimolecular, or we can have termolecular, and termolecular means 3 species, unimolecular means 1, and bimolecular means 2. So this is going to relate to order of reaction. Something that is unimolecular has an order of reaction of 1. Something that is bimolecular has an order of reaction of 2. Something that is termolecular would have an order of reaction of 3. So unimolecular has a rate of K times some concentration A to the first power, that's first order. Bimolecular is going to be second order, so it can either be one species that needs 2 particles to collide or 2 separate species that must collide. Both of these are second order overall and therefore bimolecular. Termolecular reactions require 3 or more particles colliding, and that's very rare. It's rare because you're really just not going to get 3 particles colliding very commonly, and therefore it's not a common mechanism. Now, the rate determining step is the slowest step in the reaction. So in this example of an energy diagram, we have a large activation energy for the first step, and then we have the transition state falling to the intermediate Intermediate is going to be in this well of potential energy. Then we have the second activation energy. So this is the activation energy of step 2, which would be a faster step. It's a smaller activation energy. Then we have the products. So the intermediate would be placed here, and these asterisks represent transition states during each of the elementary steps. Let's look at another example reaction that is a 2-step mechanism. The first step is the rate determining step, which means it is the slow step. In this example, an NO2Cl molecule will decompose to form NO2 plus Cl, and then one of those, that Cl atom, will react with another NO2Cl to form NO2 plus Cl2. So that means that Cl is an intermediate. And if I look at the overall reaction, 2 NO2Cls will form 2 NO2s and 1 Cl2. So the rate determining step is a unimolecular reaction. See if I spelled unimolecular correctly. So that means the rate is equal to K times NO2Cl. Excuse me, I spelled Cl wrong. First order. And because that is the rate determining step, that is our rate expression. The rate equals K times NO2Cl to the first power. Notice that the rate expression for the overall reaction comes from the rate determining step. Now, what if I have a third reaction, but the second step is the slow step, which means the second step is the rate determining step. So that means the rate is K times N2O2 times O2. But N2O2 is an intermediate. So N2O2 comes from the first reaction, where I have NO times NO from the first reaction times the O2 that stays from the second reaction. So that means this NO2 is represented here and this O2 stays. So overall, the rate is equal to K times NO squared times O2. So that means NO squared, NO is second order, and O2 is first order. Overall, this is third order. But notice that I have a bimolecular first step and a bimolecular second step. I don't actually have a termolecular or third order single step. So if the rate determining step comes after the first step, I have to work backwards. So I started with the rate expression for the rate determining step, but because N2O2 is an intermediate, I had to figure out what concentration of N2O2 will be based on this collision between NO. So that's where that comes from. One question that might come up is, can a reactant end up with a zero order reaction rate? Is that possible? So the way that a reactant ends up with zero order reaction rate is if the reactant from the overall reaction is not actually a reactant in the rate determining step. So let's go back to this reaction. NO2 plus CO makes NO plus CO2. If the first step is the rate determining step, CO is not part of that. So CO would be zero order and NO2 would be second order. And that is our rate expression, K times NO2 squared. Now, one of the things we have to remember is this rate law, rate expression, comes first. So I determined this based on experimental evidence, and remember that we did that in 16.1a. We learned how to do that with data. So once we have the data for the rate expression, then we can propose some mechanisms. There are actually more modern ways to study mechanisms that we can spend a little bit of time talking about. They involve spectroscopy and labeling isotopes and things like that. But generally speaking, the mechanisms have to be supported by the rate law. If the mechanism is not supported by the rate law, then it is not a possible mechanism. Checkpoint question. So let's look at this reaction again. NO2 plus CO will make CO2 plus NO. If it occurs by a one-step collision process, what would be the expected rate expression for this reaction? Translation, what is the rate expression for this reaction if it occurs in one step as written here? So this is a response question. Please type in your original answer. Don't worry about superscripts or subscripts. I'll understand. And so here's an example. NO2 squared plus CO to the third power would be second order for NO2, third order for CO. That's the wrong answer, but that's just an example of this representing this. So I'm looking for you to write, excuse me, sorry about that. I'm looking for you to write the rate expression for this overall reaction if it occurs by a one-step collision process. And if it is a one-step collision process, the rate would be NO2 to the first order, CO to the first order as well, if it were a one-step collision process. Now, I'm not sharing the actual data with you. This is a hypothetical question, just to kind of practice the idea of making rate expressions. Let's look at another one. We're going to use a multiple choice question for this one. Here's a overall reaction, and here's a mechanism. If it is shown to be second order with respect to NO2, is this consistent with this mechanism? True, false? I have no idea. Those are your possible answers. Pause the video, give it some thought. Come back in a second. All right, here we go. The answer is true. If this is the slow step involves NO2 colliding with NO2, which means NO2 is second order. And so there's our rate expression. Is it consistent with that mechanism where NO2 is second order? Yes. Now, last little bit here is talking about catalysts again and altering a reaction mechanism, introducing a step with a lower activation energy. And catalysts must be involved in the rate determining step. So we've looked at sort of a general overview of an enthalpy diagram. This overall diagram does not look at mechanisms, and we've observed that a catalyst would have a lower activation energy barrier. But what might happen actually is a catalyst might provide a two-step mechanism. If we look at the overall simplified version, maybe there's a two-step mechanism and the catalyst lowers the activation energy barrier for the two steps, lower than the overall activation energy barrier. And so we have a faster reaction rate. Here's another example. The catalyst creates an alternate path with a new mechanism. The new mechanism has a lower activation energy and thus a faster reaction. And so maybe this is a transition state or transient state with an activated complex here. Maybe here I have an intermediate, but the overall activation energy is smaller. Connections to other topics. Mechanisms in organic chemistry will be something we look at. We've looked at the mechanism for ozone depletion. So now we have a little bit more of an idea of how mechanisms interact with rate, specifically the order of reaction. As a quick summary, the order of reaction can only be determined experimentally. Any proposed mechanism must agree with the order of reaction data, and the rate expression for the overall reaction is related to the rate expression for the rate determining step. On the back of your notes handout, I've given you a practice problem that relates 16.1a and 16.1b into one problem. So I'd like you to work on this. When I say we'll discuss this next class, that just means in terms of the context of when you're required to finish this video. So make sure you understand the context of what I've asked of you for the video, and when we are going to talk about the video is when you need to have put some time into this follow-up practice problem. Thanks for listening. Please put your answers to the questions. There were two questions, a response question and a multiple choice question, into the Google form. You also can provide feedback and you can ask questions. 16.1b reaction mechanisms. Thank you. Have a great day. See you in class.